Particulars Partha DASGUPTA, Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge. Professor DASGUPTA also taught at the London School of Economics at the University of Stanford, California, where he was also professor of physics, and he was also at the board of the International Institute of Economics, Stockholm.
Partha DASGUPTA si interessa di parecchi temi dove ha dato contributi.
DASGUPTA has investigated several topics and he deals with different topics and different areas. He has investigated social capital, populations, wealth, development, economics of games, and so on and so forth. The list would be too long. The list of all the awards and acknowledgements obtained by DASGUPTA is very long. So I won't list all the acknowledgements that he received. This afternoon, we will have a presentation on social capital as an economic asset. Well, the word capital is something which is taught very early when you go to university. And capital is a very much discussed element. It is both physical, financial, human, intangible knowledge. And for those who are not experts in economics, capital can be seen as a counterpart of cultural capital and then social capital. So the concept of social capital is perhaps the most difficult to capture and to measure. And this afternoon, Partha DASGUPTA will deal exactly with these problems. If you look in Wikipedia, you will see that the first statement, the first concept is that for economics, sociology, for philosophy, for behavioral studies, and for other disciplines, the word capital is fundamental. Partha DASGUPTA has contributed to the concept of social capital from the viewpoint of its economic value and the contribution that it can give to explain the conditions of populations and explain the level of development of populations and how capital can favor growth or discourage growth. I'd like to thank the festival for giving me the honor to introduce this event, and I would like to thank Professor DASGUPTA for what he will tell you on this subject matter, social capital as an economic asset.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, particularly to be able to speak on the idea of social capital in Italy. It's a very appropriate country. I wouldn't have liked to speak on social capital, let us say, in Los Angeles or New York, but Trento seems absolutely appropriate. All social scientists, and obviously economists included, wish to see the world through one lens, not many, many lenses. Physicists do that, biologists wish to do that. any social scientist worth his or her name wants to do it too, because if there isn't a single lens through which you see the social world, then you basically believe that it cannot be understood, because our activities are related to one another. When we go to the bank, that's one activity. When we get married, that's another activity. When we buy goods and services, another activity. But we feel that a reasonably integrated person thinks through these options and sees how best to maneuver himself or herself through society. And being a social scientist, I have certainly never ceased to think that there might be a way of looking at the social world through a unified glass or lens. And when I see the social world, I don't mean only the world of the West or the North, as we call it these days, but also the world of the South, the poor countries in Africa, South Asia, which is where I come from. There should not be a different economics there from the economics here, although, of course, institutions are very different, and people behave very often very differently. Question, why? We have all come from the same pot, in some sense. If you trace us back sufficient thousands of years ago, we came from the same pot, and we have diverged. But the divergence needs to be seen in some way from the commonality of the human experience. It is customary in modern days to think about the distinctness of individuals, that people differ from one another, because each of us has his own, quote, identity, unquote. And it's of course true, but in my way of looking at things, that's the uninteresting part of us. What's really interesting is how similar we are and what follows from that similarity. Now, I ask this question, or these questions, or make these observations, because a year ago I started writing a book, which to me was the hardest book to write. It was a very short introduction to economics for general public, all of us, anybody who wishes to understand what economics is about. And it was a hard task in the sense that I didn't really know how to enter a book like that, in the sense of not really understanding what the fundamental question of economics may be. So what I want to do in the next 40 minutes is to try and give you what I think economics is about and why social capital is in some sense at the heart of it. And you might say, well, that's odd because economics is now over 200 years old and nobody ever spoke about social capital until very recently. So what's going on? Economists, the moment you meet an economist, you immediately see markets written on his forehead. If you meet a political scientist, you see government or the state written on his forehead. So where does this object come from? And I want to take you through a kind of reasoning to explain why the foundations of my subject is something like social capital. Now, never mind that it is called social capital. Economists don't like the word, that's fine. Ignore the word, or the term. By the term I will mean, by social capital, let me begin by giving you a clean definition, but definitions are only useful if they do something for you. So I'll first give you the definition, and then I'll forget the definition, because that's not what's important. What's important is what are the questions we ought to be asking, and how should we best understand the social world around us. By social capital, I shall mean interpersonal networks. And that's it. People know one another. I meet a person, shake hands. We have a connection. What we do with that connection is a different matter. Whether after shaking hands we go and have a drink, whether we do business, whether we take out our knives and try and kill each other, that follows later. But the point is, making a connection and having a link is the basis of social capital. That's what I'm going to call it. Of course, it can be more than two people. It could be 10, 15. It could even be that you don't know, it may be that you know somebody else, and you know somebody, and somebody knows somebody else. You don't know that somebody else. Nevertheless, there is a link through that somebody. Okay? So A knows B, B knows C, A may not know C, but A knows C indirectly through B. And I don't need to belabor the consequences of those kinds of links. Now, the book I wrote, and this is not an advertisement, you don't have to buy it, is a very small book called Economics, A Very Short Introduction. And it's just come out from Oxford University Press, and I will take you, this is how I began the book, and today's lecture is about the first chapter of what economics is about. I think the fundamental problem of economics, or pretty much any social relationship, is the problem of trust. And so imagine the following situation. A group of people have, for some reason or the other, met and have realized that they have discovered a mutually advantageous course of actions. What do I mean by that? I mean that there are some things they can do together, if they agree on it, which will, in principle, make them all better off. Financially, maybe, psychologically, maybe, doesn't matter, whatever they regard as the basis of feeling better. Okay? Now, I'm going to give you a whole bunch of examples of what I mean when I talk about a group of people discovering a mutually advantageous course of actions. The reason I'm going to give you a lot of examples, I've got 3 already on display, is because it will sort of make you attentive to the fact that really I'm talking about life. I'm not talking about some special aspect of life. Pretty much anything, when people get together and say, maybe let's go out and have a drink in a bar, that may be one of the courses of action I have in mind. But let me give you some more important or momentous examples. Well, for example, it could be that the citizens of a nation have seen the benefits of adopting a constitution for their country because they feel it's a good idea. Things will happen if they have one. England, for example, just at the moment, every now and then talks about adopting a formal constitution. So it could be that. That's very momentous. Second example, sharing the costs and benefits of maintaining a communal resource, common property resource. It could be an irrigation system, it could be a grazing field, it could be a coastal fishery. These examples are very prominent in poor countries, by the way. And of course, at lunch, I was alerted to the fact that it's very prominent in Italy and in the Alpine regions as well. 3, could be constructing a jointly usable asset. Villages in sub-Saharan Africa might decide that they would like to create a drainage channel in a watershed which will collect water. One person can't do it, lots of people together can do it, but then they have to share the water as well. So there is a decision of how to distribute the benefits as well as how to distribute the burdens. But taking it all together, it's a good idea, they say. 4th example, collaborating in political activity. Robert Putnam's famous book on Italy started with that idea. Civic engagement, lobbying. Oh, lobbying I say because if you don't like social capital, you say, aha, people or civic engagement, all it means is a bunch of people are getting together and creaming more surplus out of society for themselves. That's called lobbying. Still, there are the group of people who want to do something, and that might be lobbying, getting together and saying, well, let us complain because the civil service is not very good here. That could be, and that's an activity. 5, do business when the purchase and delivery of goods can't be synchronized. I need to borrow. I need credit. I go to somebody, and he offers me credit, but of course, and that's the mutually advantageous course of action is that he offers me the credit, I take it, I pay him back. Okay? He gains, I gain. Insurance, taking out insurance, similar. Wage labor, another example. I work now and I get paid later. But we both gain, presumably, otherwise we wouldn't be engaged in it. 6, enter marriage. That's a mutually, at least ex ante, it looks a mutually advantageous course of action. I should say, as somebody who's been married for 39 years, even ex post, it's good news. Initiating a reciprocal arrangement. I help you now that you're in need, with the understanding that you will help me when I'm in need. That's a kind of insurance, by the way. It's a kind of a contract. Not written down necessarily, but a mutual understanding. It happens non-stop, all the time in rural communities or poor countries, where established institutions aren't there. And I'll come back to that, by the way. I'm trying to give you a lead as to where I'm heading. 8, creating a partnership to produce goods for the market. Could be a cooperative. 9, entering into an instantaneous transaction. Going to the supermarket, purchasing something across the counter. That's a mutually advantageous relationship, by the way. You may not know the salesperson, but you're getting a commodity at a price low enough for you to feel you have benefited. Presumably, the seller is gaining as well. 10, to come back to something much more abstract, being civil to one another. A general agreement that we will not deface public property, we will nod when we meet each other, just being courteous. It's not exactly a bountiful commodity these days, by the way. In England, people are very worried that civic attitudes have deteriorated to the point that people are rude to one another in public. So this is not exactly a non sequitur. Okay, so here, that's a whole bunch of examples. And of course, one can give more. So now, these people who have found a mutually beneficial course of actions, let us imagine that they have agreed on how to share the benefits and burdens of that course of action. Benefits and burdens are very technical terms in some sense, and I'm not sure they have immediate interpretation in Italian, but like costs and benefits, put it that way. Okay? So if you want to get together and build a common property, drainage system, there are some costs involved, labor if nothing else, and the benefits are sharing the water. So there's we are assuming that there has been agreement reached. Now, I should tell you that that assumption, of course, is a very major one. It may be that they won't reach an agreement, and then they fight. Wars, civil wars, and so forth. So I'm ignoring a very important problem in economics, which is how do people reach agreement? The reason I'm ignoring it is because we just don't have enough of an understanding. I should come clean. No economist in his right mind should claim that he understands how agreements are actually reached. So I'm going to suppose that the agreement has been reached. There is now a further problem. And here's the question. Here's the problem. Under what circumstances would the people or parties who have reached agreement trust one another to keep their word? That, in my judgment, is the fundamental problem of economics and the social sciences in general, and unraveling it will enable you to understand the multitude of institutions that have been created throughout the world dependent on the circumstances. Because the question of trust here is extremely fundamental. Most of the examples I have given you are non-synchronized. I offer my service now, I get the benefit later. How do I know that the person with whom I've reached agreement will award me the benefit when later arrives? Okay? If I doubt it, then I will not offer my service, in which case the whole agreement unravels and nothing happens. That's why the issue of trust is of central importance. It's important even when you go into the counter to buy something in the supermarket. You might say, well, there's no synchronization. There is synchronization. I hand over money, I get the commodity. So what's the problem? Well, there are two problems. One, it may be packaged, and I won't know what's inside it until I get home. But usually I trust it to be all right. Now, question, why? And so we're back to the question. And there is another problem, which is, how does the person who has received the money know that it's not counterfeit, the cash that I've given him? Presumably he trusts me, or trusts something, perhaps the institution, that will punish me in case it is counterfeit. So there are different layers of trust involved, but no matter what transaction it is, there's some form of trust involved in it. Okay? So that's the question. What are the circumstances under which parties would have reached agreement, trust one another to keep their word? I can think of 4 broad examples, and I'm going to go through them very quickly. I'm going to go through the first 2 very quickly, and then I'm going to go to 3 and 4 and spend the rest of my discussion on it. The first example is when first context would be one where the people involved are fond of each other. And I suppose the household is the best example. The family is probably the best example of a context in which the issue of trust is resolved through the fact that people involved know that they're fond of one another. Remember, it's not enough for you to be fond of the other party. You need to know that the other party is also fond of you. So the way the thing works here is that you, in some sense, the persons internalize the feelings of the other party because they care about one another. So the reason I trust my wife, or my wife trusts me, in the many engagements that we are involved in every day, we don't write contracts. We don't call a lawyer to say, here's the contract, I will go shopping, you will do the cooking, or I'll pick up the children at the end of the day. These are tacit. And yet it works. So the question is why? Presumably I expect her promises to be fulfilled and vice versa. One reason could be, and that's the one I'm appealing to here, there are many other reasons maybe, but this one is mutual affection. I will feel bad if I let you down, or let my wife down, because I'm fond of her, because I know that she will feel let down. So in some sense, the cost will be borne by me in negating myself, or not doing what I said I would do. I have the incentives. Now I'm using economics words. I have the incentives to do what I said I would do, because if I don't do it, I will feel bad. Why? Because I will have let my wife down, and I'm very fond of her. That's the kind of argument. Now, I want to go beyond that, because I can't get very far with affection as a context, because households have to trade with one another, and there need not be any affection there. Okay? So the second one, which enables us to broaden the context in which trust may be created, is where the idea is that people are pro-socially disposed. Sometimes we say here, people are moral. In the economics literature, in recent years, particularly in what is called the new behavioral economics, a great deal of attention has been paid to this. And economists have been criticized for having a rather narrow view of human nature. So the idea here is that we are not all selfish. We care about the fact that if we say we've given our word, then our word is our bond. And the idea here is not mutual affection, but it's looking at yourself in the mirror. What kind of a person am I who says he will do something and then doesn't do it? That's the idea of pro-social disposition. Something like an idea that you have some personal integrity, that you are pro-socially disposed. If you have shaken hands with a person to say you will do something, then if you don't do it, it's not that you care about that other person, but you care about your own view of yourself. That's the idea. That's one way of looking at it. Okay, so if people are thus formed, if people are like that, are pro-socially disposed, the argument goes, why then? They will trust one another. The problem is, though, that we are more or less pro-socially disposed. Most cynical people will say everybody has a price. At some price, some benefit, he will not do what he said he will do. The problem is nobody knows what other people's prices are. So you can't have a society built on the idea that everybody is a person of integrity. That's the problem. Different people, like Mahatma Gandhi, probably had an infinite price. If he said something, he will do it no matter what. Mother Teresa, yes, maybe. Perhaps we all would be a positive price, and hopefully a very high price before we do not do what we said we would do, but other people don't know what they are, and if they don't, you worry. Transactions won't take place. So a society cannot rely on two. So what is left? Well, there are two alternative ways, and I want to spend the next 20 minutes discussing them, because they lead us to the heart of economics, institutions, and at the end, it will be social capital all over again. External enforcement of the agreement. So one idea would be that this group of people who have agreed to share their benefits and burdens in a particular way go to an external authority. Could be a village chieftain, could be a priest, somebody in charge, if you like, who has got the authority. In the modern state, of course, it will be the state, at whatever level. It doesn't have to, could be provincial level, could be a city level, could be a national level, but that would depend on the contract, if you like. And the subtext is that the enforcement is by the rule of law. Extreme example would be that the parties have actually gone to a lawyer and drawn up a contract. And the contract says A will do that, A will do this, B will do that, C will do that, and so forth and so on. And that's written down in the form of a legal contract, and it's binding once the people have signed it. You know, the parties know in advance what the penalties are for failure to comply with the agreement. It could be a fine, in some cases it could be jail, and so forth and so on. Something which will be a dramatic cost, a high cost, and of course that will act as the deterrent, and the deterrence will keep people keeping to the agreement. And this third one, the external enforcement, is the basis on which much of economic reasoning goes. We talk about the market as an institution, and we ask, well, how does the market function? All sorts of transactions are taking place in the market, whether it's competitive or not, it's not the issue. How do these transactions take? Why do people trust one another to carry out these transactions? Because all the problems that I've mentioned already are embedded in any market transaction. So what's going on? And the answer is, well, presumably there is a contract. I promise to pay you for delivery of these goods now in 6 months' time when I'm buying in the market and the payment is made later. And a contract is signed. And the cost of my transgressing the contract presumably will be lower than the cost the cost of transgressing the contract will be presumably a lot higher than the cost of carrying out the contract, and that is why I carry it out. So, and of course, the legal profession uses the external enforcement as the basis on which to think about contractual relationships. There's nothing that I'm saying here is new. But there's a problem with the answer. And you probably have already figured it out. The problem is, why should the parties trust the external enforcer to do the enforcing? After all, the external enforcer, we say it's the government. But the government is not some abstract entity. It's composed of a lot of civil servants and politicians, the people who are in the government sector. Well, they're human beings, and it costs them presumably something to enforce contracts. So why should you believe that they will do what you expect them to do, which is to enforce the contract that you have actually signed? So in some sense, us saying that there is an external enforcer is not really answering the question, is really delaying the question. delaying answering the question, because you just basically shove the answer to a higher level by saying, well, there is that authority. So the question really is, the problem is that if the people who have signed the contract, I'm using the word contract now because I'm thinking in terms of the rule of law as a way of thinking about external enforcement, but it doesn't have to be the rule of law or contract. In a village community, it could be the chieftain. He is the rule of law. And he may have heard that you have agreed on this, or you go to the chieftain and say, well, look, we agreed to do this, and I gave him this, and he's not giving it back to me, or something. And then the chieftain asks questions around to see whether I'm telling the truth, whether the other party is telling the truth, and then makes a decision and says, no, my ruling is this should happen, or you get punished, or you get shunned, or so forth. But the question nevertheless arises, why should they trust the chieftain to carry out his job honestly? This is not obviously a theoretical question. We have examples of so many failed states in the world today that this is absolutely a vital, living question. And why maybe societies don't prosper when the state cannot be trusted to enforce agreements. Africa is full of them. And to larger or smaller extent, there is malfeasance in every society. And it's useful to think of extreme cases just to understand how delicately balanced this whole network of trust is needed in any society. We forget that the whole thing is hanging on a lot of abstract expectations that each of us has over others. Otherwise, the whole thing unravels. So it's well worth thinking about societies which are doing extremely badly to understand perhaps not why some societies like yours are working well, but at least it's salutary that, but for the grace of God, maybe even you will go down, if you see what I mean. At least I try and persuade myself that I'm very lucky to live in a society where these expectations are hanging, in some sense, in a way which is mutually helpful. So the third example, the external enforcement, we have noticed, doesn't really answer. So what does answer? Well, I'm going to end by telling you that in some sense, I don't know the answer, and none of us economists knows the answer. But we are getting nearer, in some sense. And I should tell you another thing, which is, if you understand why you don't understand something, you have really understood something important. And I will end the lecture by explaining the sense in which we do not understand something. But now I can say what it is we don't understand. 5 years, 10 years ago, I couldn't have, so I suppose we have learned something. Fourth example, and that's the one which I want to harp on because the idea of social capital, in my judgment, sits at the bottom of it, is mutual agreement, mutual enforcement of agreement. Now, the idea here is that the agreement is, people are confident that the agreement will be carried out because they have an understanding that if any one of the parties violates the terms of the agreement, then the other remaining members of party will punish him in some way. Okay? We use the word social norms for it. So instead of the rule of law, we think of social norms. Now, in social norms, the idea is, when we talk about a social norm, it could be normal thing, very usual humdrum norms, and it could be momentous norms. By social norm, we mean an agreed upon strategy. Strategy is a technical term we economists use, but it's not very difficult to understand what it is. A strategy is a conditional set of actions. I will do this if that happens. I will do that if you do this. That kind of sentence constitutes a strategy. I will be nice to you if you are nice to me. I will lend you this if you do that for me. That's called a strategy. So a strategy is a set of actions that you have planned, and each action will be based on what has happened before that action. Okay? So these are conditional actions. A social norm is a conditional set of actions that everybody follows. That's why we call it social. Okay? And it could be pure customs. Christmas comes, certain behavioral, an outsider will find Italians behaving somewhat interestingly before Christmas. Some things, and people expect each other to do it. What happens if you don't do it? Well, that's the key thing. For a norm to be a norm, it must be the case that it's in the interest of each of the parties to abide by the norm. Otherwise, it would not be a norm. When would it be in the interest of the party to abide by the norm? So the idea of a norm here is, a norm is a social norm. A set of behavioral rules is a social norm if following it is in the interest of each party on the assumption that all the other parties are following that norm. That condition is extremely important. If you think that everybody else is following the norm, and it is in your interest to follow the norm, it need not be, by the way, but suppose it is, and if that is true for everybody, then if everybody thinks that everybody else is following the norm, then everybody will follow the norm. It'll hang together through mutual expectations. So the norm needs to be in the interest of each party, provided everybody else is following the norm. That's very important. The second condition is extremely important because it could be that even if you have the norm in place, the norm being, let me give you an example. So if you've taken out an agreement about, say, insurance. I help you now, you're in need, and you will help me when I'm in need. Okay? I'm in need, somebody helps me. Then tomorrow, that same person is in need, comes to me for help, and I say, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Okay? I've broken the norm. Because the norm is that if you have accepted help, you repay, you practice reciprocity. Now, the basis of this mutual enforcement lies in the possibility that society, and this is a very key part of it, that society is in some sense stable. It's going to be there tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and the day after, and so forth. People can migrate, but the migration needs to be correlated. Nomadic tribes in Africa migrate, but they migrate together, following the waterholes in the semi-arid areas. So it's not so much migration, but it's coordinated migration. If you're, of course, in a sedentary occupation in one particular country, or a particular village, let us say, you meet each other every year, every day, every year, life goes on. You die, but your son is there, or your daughters are there, and so the dynasty goes on. Now you can see where I'm heading. A social norm operates and can operate, in principle, because there is always a tomorrow. The punishment will be withdrawal of help when I'm in need in the future. That's the punishment. That's the mutual enforcement. The punishment doesn't come from an external enforcer, but from withdrawal of cooperation in the future if you cease to cooperate at any stage of the game. That's the threat. That's the social norm. So the social norm says, whatever the agreement is, you're doing it, say the reciprocity one, but that if somebody fails, then the norm also has a negative side to it, which is withdrawal of cooperation with the person who broke the agreement. That's the punishment, because then he will lose by having to work alone rather than with others for the mutually advantageous course of action. So the fourth thing has shown us that time is important. A society which lives for only one period, none of this is going to work. Okay? So that's a very good clue. It's telling us another thing, that even if it's going to be there tomorrow, if people have very strong doubts about whether there will be a tomorrow between these people, each other that is, then again it won't work. That is why you cannot have norms of behavior, strictly speaking, in a very mobile society. You live in an apartment house in Los Angeles, and you don't know your neighbor, the reason is that yesterday's neighbor is not today's neighbor, or not tomorrow's neighbor. They're constantly moving in and out. Now, in that kind of a world, you're not going to have reciprocity. I mean, maybe with bread and butter, maybe with a bit of milk or coffee, yes. That's the pro-social part of it. But if it comes to $1,000 of loan, no. Because you don't know whether the person will be there tomorrow. And so, although there is a future tomorrow, that person doesn't personify that future. So we learn another thing, which is something like cohesion in a society. Some kind of a link which persists over time is required for four to work. Okay? A further requirement is that in some sense, that link should not be broken. That link could be broken because of one reason I've just now mentioned, that people are mobile, individually mobile. But it could be also because you've got a predatory state which is trying to destroy the community. This has happened in Africa over and over again in the last 40 years, where the state interferes, enters a rural community and says, you do not have the authority for these transactions. It's the state. We are responsible. You have to come to us for, in other words, moving from 4 to 3. But if you move from 4 to 3, and the state is either corrupt or inept, then the people in question, the parties, fall down again. Okay? So this is just a very rough background, but the key point is that these norms that I mentioned is also a way of understanding external enforcement. And some of the early work on social capital was trying to show that. Robert Putnam's work on Italy was designed to argue that social capital, in the sense that I'm talking about now, social norms of behavior, are required, necessary to discipline the state, discipline the center, the state, and therefore make it more plausible that people could trust the state, the external enforcer, to enforce the agreement. So even 3, the external enforcement at some level, can only be explained through the operations of the citizens. And that's why 4 is in some sense the basis on which everything else follows in social life. Let me try and summarize now. In their modern form, markets operate under the rule of law, and the external enforcer is the state, in the pristine notion of markets. Markets are institutions, and they are very different, and they are the institutions that we economists study all the time. But what we don't study very much, and that's what I'm trying to open up at this wonderful festival, is the idea that we should be studying communities also. Communities are a very different kind of institution, and communitarian institutions are the basis of their functioning is, of course, social norms. Of course, within a community, people also sign contracts. We live in a world in which there are many institutions which are operating simultaneously. We operate in many institutions simultaneously. We are in a household, we are in our club, we operate in the market, we are in a community, we operate as citizens, and so forth. No question about that, but it's useful to think about extreme forms of institutions to see how they operate. And what I'm suggesting is that so much of our transactions, even in the West, even in the North, operate not through markets, nor through the states, but through communities, informal agreements, informal transactions, based on mutual expectations, and I've tried to give you a sense of how that works. So, social capital, in my way of thinking, consists of interpersonal networks. It is the basis on which trust is created and maintained, and the beauty of it is that that trust can be maintained even among people who do not know one another. Now, why? And the reason is that if the groups of people who trust one another and then have links through the states, and the states are governed through the rule of law, then you can trust through your transactions people whom you have never met. Not because you like them or they like you, but there is a chain of mutual expectations, including fear of punishment in case of malfeasance, that might be working through norms or might be working through the rule of law, it doesn't matter. But when you are a transaction, you are buying a commodity which was, let us say, produced in China, and it has been carried all this way and it's found itself in a market here, and you purchase it, you are in some sense trusting the Chinese producer who you do not know, and he's trusting that his product is going to find a market and you'll be paid for it. Now, if you now think through the chain by which that transaction has taken place, you will find that at every stage, it is either the rule of law or the social norm which has been operating to keep that transaction, the expectation of a fulfilled transaction, in place. So, obviously, the world is run through, in my judgment, through all four. All four are necessary. But for largish transactions outside the household, outside mutual affection, it seems to me the basis is something like mutual enforcement, because that's the basis on which everything else hangs. Simply to say there is a rule of law means nothing. Every society that I have ever studied says that civil servants must be honest. There's no constitution which says the government should cheat. It's unthinkable. This happens in Nigeria, it'll happen in Congo, before in Zaire, Mobutu, no doubt. It was all enshrined. But in some places the expectations failed, others they have stayed. And that, I will want to end by saying that's where I hit a roadblock. All I've been talking to you about is how it is possible for people to entertain expectations if social norms are adequately formed, that the threat, the threat of sanctions that are embedded in social norms prevents people from breaking them, and so you're hanging together with promises being kept, and people trust one another rationally to carry out what they said they would do. But in that same society, suppose by some bad magic, some black magic, everybody doubted everybody else. That no, he's not going to follow the norm. And he says, no, she won't follow the norm. Then each would find it in his interest to withdraw from the cooperation. Because rationally he says the others aren't not going to follow the norm, they will cheat. So why should I enter the transaction? And that mutual expectation is also fulfilling. At the end of the day, nobody transacts. You have a very unprogressive society, and yet, deep down, everybody says, oh my gosh, that was a good thing I didn't transact because they're all cheats out there. And everybody's saying that. So even if the fundamentals of society are correct, you could have one outcome which is good and another outcome which is bad. Question, to which I have no answer. How is it? How can you propel a society to get into that mutually confident or mutually respecting expectations such that you hang together at a transaction which are cooperative, as opposed to one where you've essentially given up? Either you've become autarkic, or you've gone to the street with swords and daggers and fighting each other. We economists do not have an answer to that, as to how that expectation is formed. But we now know, at least in a way that we did not 15, 20 years ago, that that's at the heart of the social problem. Thank you very much.
Grazie a Partha DASGUPTA per questa illuminante lezione che...
Many thanks to Partha DASGUPTA for this enlightening presentation on social capital and for leading us into these complex aspects which normally those who analyze the economic behavior of people, as DASGUPTA said, give for granted, give as a starting point. Now there is some time for the questions or comments, points of curiosity.
I'm Jack Berner, I teach economics.
Jack Berner, insegno economia in questa università. Ecco, questa è un'espressione di fiducia prima di fare il mio commento. Lei ha parlato del mercato e di...
And communities. Can't you hear me? Should I keep the microphone closer? Can you hear me now? Mm-hmm. You make a rather neat distinction between markets on the one hand, which need, let's say, the state as a sort of guarantor for transactions to be carried out, and communities on the other hand, where trust is much more important. I see much more of a continuity between both, which is something that is based also on work by network sociologists, such as Harrison White and Ron Budd, who in a way have put the discipline of economics to shame because they made more progress in explaining how markets really function. Very briefly, markets function and are stable and continue to exist if the perception of both sides to the market, the demanders and the suppliers, are sufficiently congruent. You can't have a state stepping in for that or substituting for a lack of congruence of expectations, which, by the way, is something Adam Smith already stressed in his theory of moral sentiments.
Thank you very much. I think I will take the questions as they come because I tend to forget. I quite agree with you. We don't have a disagreement at all. These are sharp distinctions because they take us in different bases, but I ended by saying we live in a mixed environment, and every one of them has to do with, they're related, except for the fact that the external enforcement aspect of it, I'm pretty convinced now, because it involves people, not a computer, we are really, at the end of the day, coming back to something like mutual enforcement. However, since you've asked me a very good question, let me try and elaborate on one thing which I did not have time to discuss, that these are important things for us to think about. One reason this is a useful subject to begin a festival with, by the way, is that we all can think about social capital. We can all think through it, extend it. Whether you come from economics or not, it's not irrelevant because we are citizens in some sense. And that one is that there is a weakness in communities. There are many weaknesses of communities, by the way. I mean, the negative side I have not talked about here. One weakness is that it's very limiting. Strictly speaking, community or agreements which are through mutual enforcement are personalized. So these transactions are personalized. You are giving me the object, not she. So it's a names matter. When you talk about reputation, names matter. It's not a shop. It's a particular name of a shop, the person in it. And in some sense, again, an extreme, although, again, like the question, the gentleman who asked the question, the things are blurred, but the fact they're blurred doesn't mean that there isn't a difference. And this is the difference I want to hint at. The markets have the advantage, or the ideal form of markets, is that they're anonymous. So when somebody says, my money is as good as yours, that sounds very vulgar, but it makes a point which says that the transaction is not named. It is not a personal one. It's impersonal. A second difference is, it's a little more tricky, but in the external enforcement, whether or not people have complied with the agreement must be in some sense observable publicly. And that's why you need lawyers, you have law courts. You're trying to verify that something actually happened, which is being claimed as having happened, or didn't happen if it's claimed that it didn't happen. Whereas in mutual enforcement, the parties need to observe whether they have been complied. Nobody else needs to know. You don't have to go to the law courts to prove something in their extreme forms. So these distinctions are very important because they tell us what will work when and why not. It's important to recognize these things because we live in urban societies, but suppose you might imagine that norms that will develop in a forest, people who live in the forests, the Amazon, will be very different from the norms that would develop, let us say, in a mountain region, or that will develop in a coastal plain, or in a river valley. Because what can be observed, what can't be observed, are a bit tenuous. In mountains, you can hide and so forth. Observations are very costly. So these are hints I'm trying to give you because when you think about the next time you buy something or you promise something and you ask, well, was the promise credible or the purchase reasonable? These are some of the questions that you would want to ask. Okay.
C'è stato un passaggio.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Well, at one point in your presentation, you said that in very mobile societies, social norms may be weakened by this high mobility. But in our Latin societies, where mobility is not very marked, we have the impression, however, that these social norms are not present, or that social capital is based on something very limited, something which remains within the framework of families or small groups. Don't you think that the more mobile is a society and the stronger the need for social norms?
Well, these are all extremely hard questions. They're very deep questions. Yes, I quite agree. Why does this happen, though? Mobility, I was arguing, uncoordinated mobility of the Los Angeles variety, Southern California variety, makes it very hard for social capital to develop. But that doesn't, of course, the negation of that is not that people who are not mobile, social capital will necessarily develop. I wasn't suggesting that. And in fact, I was suggesting that you could have mutual expectations which are completely absent. I mean, good mutual expectations. Banfield, very famous book on Edwin Banfield, 1957 book, was of a completely dysfunctional community which was not mobile. It was very stagnant, but people were in the equilibrium that I was describing at the end, where everybody mistrusted everybody. Okay, so that can happen, of course. But there is something that in your question that I think is very deep and very difficult to understand. At least I don't understand it. There's some substitution effect that takes place. You see, one reason anthropologists love communities, and very often development economists or development activists love communities, and why many of my hardened economics friends talk about social capital as something very positive terms, who 20 years ago would never have done so, find that when they go into village communities in Africa, Asia, South Asia, they find that so much of the society is being kept alive through these reciprocal arrangements embedded in what we call now social capital. Credit, insurance, and so forth. These are two extremely important transactions, credit and insurance, by the way. And they're happening within the community. No, there are no big firms out there. There's no stock market or anything like that. Now, it's one thing to say that a society has found, a community has found a way to live, to survive. Another thing to say that it's a very efficient system. So it's very easy to say that there's something wonderful about these communitarian arrangements, because without them, of course, they would not survive. But it's not an argument for saying that's how they should stay. Because we feel the state ought to be engaged, ought to be helping, building roads so that they can actually transact outside the village, diversify their risks further by taking insurance out with people who are far away from them, not with people whose risks are correlated with themselves. See, it's not much point in a farmer insuring his neighboring farmer, because if there is a drought, both are going to get hit. And so when one is in need, the other is in need, and when the other is in need, one is in need, so they can't help each other. What you need is a situation where if I'm in need, you may not be in need, and it might, and vice versa. So you need distance. So there is some kind of a displacement effect that takes place, and how we adjust to that displacement is the thing. The welfare state comes along, let us say, before which there was no welfare state, okay? Then, if you care about inequality or poverty, you have to get together as citizens and create methods by which transfer of funds can be made to those who are destitute, soup kitchens or whatever. You can think of those things. And that requires communitarian activity. We are now in social norm. But the norm is that we help the poor. Progressive state comes along. There is a official welfare legislation and it's carried out. Citizen says, well, why do I have to do this? The state is supposed to be doing that. So a whole bunch of communitarian activities are no longer followed because it's the normal course of events that if somebody falls ill, he will go to the required department for help. So there is a transfer from transactions which take place at the communitarian level to transactions which take place elsewhere. And that balance may not be done. It may happen that the balance doesn't, the transfer doesn't take place as well as we like, but there's a gain and a loss. And maybe the gain is, I don't know, but that seems to me to be what might be happening, where the state, at least in England, I get a distinct sense that so much of the burden of citizenship is now transferred to the state's authority. If you're ill, you are unemployed, it is the state which looked after you, not your neighbor. So it's now only transaction in milk, or when I run out of onions and I go to my neighbor and say, we're cooking, shops are closed, can I have an onion? That's fine. But if you need a loan, there's a bank out there, and so forth, if you see what I mean.
Io credo ci sia spazio ancora per una sola domanda.
Well, a very final question.
Sì, prego. Guardi che c'è la signora qua.
Volevo chiedere una cosa.
I have a question for you. So social capital is based on trust, so we need a moral basis to create a series of links enabling everybody to progress and grow. Well, those who violate these norms need to be punished. Well, in your opinion, the expectation of a punishment, well, should we go as high as the death penalty? And this based on a rational economic reasoning, which I don't share, but which is applied in China, for example, where we're really at the beginning with reference to the application of human rights. Just yesterday, death penalty was given to some people who had marketed counterfeit pharmaceuticals and medicines. Well, I'd like to have your opinion on this.
Only friends can ask nasty questions like that, and we are friends now. That's a very difficult question you've asked. Norms for any well-ordered society, it's quite clear, and I was highlighting that norms must involve penalties for malfeasance. It goes without saying, that's fine. You're asking about the size of the penalty, essentially. Of course, there's always these things that we couldn't discuss, there's no time, observing or verifying, depending on whether you're working on mutual enforcement or whether you're working on external enforcement. They're always imperfect. One of the arguments against the death penalty in the West has been that it's an irreversible punishment. The person dies. And there's always the sneaking worry that the evidence was not foolproof. So that's been a standard argument. If you talk to my wife, she's very much against the death penalty. Not against it, she just thinks it's out of the question. Why? She'll give you always that answer. That there's always little doubt. So you can then reverse the error if 5 years later you find the person hadn't been guilty after all. And there are cases like that that come up, and so that's the argument. But you're talking about death penalty, one doesn't have to go to that. Nevertheless, the question really is, should we have stiffer norms, stiffer punishments enshrined in the norms? Or if it's the rule of law, should the fines or the punishments, penalties be higher? Probably should, at least in some societies. In some of my more depressed moments in England, I feel yes. There is. But when I say punishment, again, it depends on where it is. We don't seem to have much in the form of punishment for what we regard typically as minor misbehavior, graffiti on the wall or something. On the other hand, there are some sociologists who argue that eliminating those malfeasances helps in eliminating the larger ones, because it's spiral. You start and you try out to see how far you can get away by misbehaving. And then the more you can get away with it, the more risk you take, or the bigger and so forth. There are some theories of that sort. I don't know how valid they are. It's a matter of judgment, and I can't, obviously, for me since this covers the whole of life, it's hard to know which ones should be tightened and which shouldn't. I suspect in contemporary societies when civic behavior in industrial societies like in England is really eroding, there is a case for some stiffer fines, if you like. Now, what the fine is, whether it's financial or public service or what, I don't know. I mean, that's something to be discussed. But taking life, that's a hard one. I couldn't answer that, really. Because there's, as I say, observing is always shot through with some uncertainty, as is verification.
Grazie. Molto rapidamente, anche se...
Well, very briefly, I have a question for you, a general question, very briefly. Where financial capital is predominant and where there is the economic power of some social classes which is predominant, and when the power is unilateral, and when multinationals are predominant, and I'm not speaking about politics here. Well, in those cases, it is difficult to have social development, to have social equity, because If the objective is only of a financial nature, it is difficult to imagine that some social classes can be mobile, get out of poverty, for example, and go up the social ladder. And the dominant classes will not leave any space. Many multinationals are so powerful. They are even more powerful than the states themselves, even in the Western world. I don't know if you have a comment on this.
I'm afraid I'm going to disappoint you. I really have very little way of observing. I think there is much in what you say. On the other side of things, people, let's say in England, Western Europe, are surely, on average, much better off now than they were in the material goods. I don't mean spiritually, but in the material sense, than they were in the 50s, even 60s. That despite the multinationals. But I think there is a lot in what you say. But sometimes I wonder whether we pick up the malfeasances of multinationals and forget perhaps many of the virtues of having large-scale transactions that are possible through great distances. So when a multinational is found to have cheated, or when the books were cooked, or where a product was badly designed, or impurities, then we read about it, rightly. And of course, the reason we read about it is because we have a free press. I mean, when I say we, I mean this part of the world, the EU, let's say. And we have a free press because the state cannot mess around with it. And the reason the state cannot mess around with it is because there is a general agreement among citizens that the free press is a good thing. And so you're hanging together with these mutual expectations. So it's correct that these bad features of multinationals are highlighted. But you don't really see very often articles talking about the general behavior of transacting, getting things at lowering prices, competing so that the average consumer can get things at a lower price than he did, and so forth. So I think my guess is that these institutions have a mixed record, some good, obviously some bad, and maybe we overly highlight the bad things. As regards power, I don't know. I mean, you're right, each of us is powerless. Quite right. You know, if you live in a society with 1 million people in your community, in your state, then you're just 1 millionth. And money can talk there, of course. People have votes in their pockets and so forth. But at least we muddle along. And I think when we, who are very fortunate to live in the European Union, and I think we are amongst the most fortunate people on earth, when we feel bad about things, I think we should think about societies which are absolutely ghastly. And they exist. And I'm not talking about poverty now. I'm talking about the basis on which the poverty is kept, maintained, sustained, and, which is lousy governments, predatory warlords, suspicious people, neighbors killing each other. So I think you're both right and wrong. Let's put it that way. Okay.
Bene, grazie a tutti per la partecipazione, buona prosecuzione col festival e grazie a Partha GALEOTTI. Yes, perfect, it was perfect.